Before we embark on our slow-flowing journey, pause for a breath. In the next 10 seconds, listen for the wind in the trees of coastal Virginia, imagine the muffled chorus of the James River, and consider that the young woman history remembers as Pocahontas never once heard that name in her own language. She was Matoaka, and her story is softer, more complex, and far more human than animated song could capture. We begin not with conquest, nor with ships, but with the breathing marshlands of Seneca. The name the Powhatan peoples gave their interconnected chiefdoms. Before we speak of collision between worlds, let us first understand the world that was complete, whole, and ancient, when Europeans were still dreaming of Western passages. Villages formed a woven tapestry of kinship where cornfields met pine woods, and where the tidal rhythm ordered daily life more reliably than any clock. Here, in this network of some 30 tribal communities, a child named Matoaka played among reed-thatched houses, her small footprints melding into deer tracks along the riverbank. Whenever I read Powhatan oral histories, I'm struck by their subtle sense of time. Seasons mattered more than years, and relationships more than possessions. It reminds me how modern schedules can shrink our sense of belonging. The Powhatan chiefdom stretched across what we now call the Tidewater region of Virginia, encompassing roughly 8,000 square miles of interconnected waterways. This wasn't wilderness. It was a carefully managed landscape. The Powhatan people practiced controlled burning to maintain meadows, rotated their agricultural plots to preserve soil fertility, and established fish weirs that could feed entire communities while allowing sustainable harvests for generations. Imagine walking through this world in 1595. You would see extensive cornfields interspersed with beans climbing the stalks and squash spreading below. The Three Sisters agriculture that sustained millions across the continent for millennia. You would pass through forests cleared at regular intervals, creating park-like spaces where deer could graze and families could gather nuts, berries, and medicinal plants. The man Europeans called Chief Powhatan was actually named Wahun Senekau, and his position was far more complex than the simple title chief suggests. He was a Mumanatawik, a paramount chief who had inherited some territories and conquered others, building a confederacy through strategic marriages, military campaigns, and diplomatic negotiations that would impress any European court. Under his leadership, the Powhatan Confederacy included the Pamunkey, Mattapony, Chickahominy, and dozens of other communities, each maintaining their own local governance while participating in the larger political structure. This was not a primitive society. It was a sophisticated civilization with established trade networks extending from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. I often wonder how different our understanding of democracy might be if European colonists had truly studied Powhatan governance rather than dismissing it as savage anarchy. Daily life in Seneca followed rhythms that modern people have largely forgotten. Work was communal and seasonal. Women maintained the agricultural cycles. Men focused on hunting and warfare, but these divisions were fluid and practical rather than rigid. Children learned by observation and participation, not through formal instruction separated from practical life. The longhouses could shelter 40 or 50 people arranged around central fires that never fully died. Stories were told in the evening darkness, histories preserved in memory rather than writing, wisdom passed down through generations of careful listening. The smell of wood smoke, the taste of hominy, the sound of mortars grinding corn, these sensory memories form the foundation of identity. This was the world into which Matoaka was born around 1596, a world complete in itself, sophisticated in ways that Europeans could not recognize, and utterly unprepared for the catastrophe that was approaching from across the ocean. Before we can understand her story, we must first understand what was lost when these two worlds collided. In many Algonquian tongues, playful nicknames carry power, but they also carry intimacy. Pocahontas, best translated as mischievous one, little wanton, or little plaything, was whispered lovingly when Matoaka tumbled through gatherings, climbed trees she shouldn't climb, or interrupted serious conversations with the fearless curiosity of childhood. This was not a name for strangers to use. This was the kind of name that siblings call each other, that parents use when scolding turns to laughter. When Europeans adopted Pocahontas as her primary identity, they were claiming an intimacy they had never earned, speaking a tenderness they did not understand. Her true name, Matoaka, translates roughly to bright stream between the hills, a name that speaks of landscape, of belonging, of a place in the natural world. This was her real identity, not a nickname born of childhood mischief, but a formal name connecting her to the geography of her homeland. I find it liberating that a future political symbol began as a restless child, her identity shaped more by river mud than by romance. Matoaka's childhood unfolded in the household of the paramount chief, which meant she witnessed diplomacy from her earliest years. She watched her father receive delegations from subordinate chiefs, observed the careful exchange of gifts that cemented alliances, learned the subtle art of reading faces and understanding the unspoken currents of political conversation. But she was also simply a child. She played with dolls made of corn husks, learned to swim in the James River, helped her mother and aunts with food preparation, and listened to the stories that shaped her understanding of the world. She would have known the tale of first woman who brought corn to the people, and first man who learned to hunt. She would have heard about the creation of the world, the responsibility of humans to maintain balance with all living things. By roughly age 10, she understood diplomacy as naturally as hide and seek, because her father, Wahunsena Kau, ruled through gifts and alliances rather than iron. In European courts, princes learned statecraft through formal education and careful instruction. In the Powhatan world, children absorbed political wisdom through daily observation, watching their elders navigate the complex relationships that held their society together. Here we encounter our first major historical distortion. Europeans immediately labeled Matoaka a princess, but this title reveals more about European thinking than Powhatan reality. In patriarchal European society, a king's daughter possessed value primarily through her potential marriage to another royal house. Her worth was measured by her ability to cement political alliances through dynastic union. Powhatan society operated differently. While Matoaka held status as the daughter of the paramount chief, her political importance came not from her marriageability, but from her potential role as a diplomat, a cultural bridge, a keeper of traditions. She was being trained not to be given away in marriage, but to be a leader in her own right. The princess label was a colonial fiction that reduced a complex political figure to a familiar European framework. It's remarkable how this single misunderstanding shaped centuries of storytelling. Wahunsenakau had many wives and many children, but oral traditions suggest that Matoaka held a special place in his affections. This wasn't simply paternal favoritism, it was recognition of her particular gifts as a diplomat and cultural interpreter. She demonstrated unusual curiosity about the world beyond Powhatan territory, unusual skill at reading human nature, and unusual courage in approaching strangers. These qualities would serve her well in the trials ahead, but they also marked her as different from her siblings. She was being prepared, perhaps unconsciously, for a role that no one could have anticipated, serving as a bridge between two worlds that seemed increasingly destined for conflict. Understanding Matoaka's childhood is crucial to understanding the woman she became. She was not simply a passive victim of historical forces, nor was she the romanticized figure of later mythology. She was a young woman trained in diplomacy, comfortable with cultural complexity, and possessed of the particular combination of curiosity and courage that history would soon demand of her. When English settlers anchored near Powhatan country in the spring of 1607, they brought with them not just ambition and disease, but a profound cultural misunderstanding that would shape every subsequent interaction. The Virginia Company's propaganda had promised easy wealth and friendly natives eager to trade. Reality proved far more complex. The Jamestown colony was failing almost from the moment of its establishment. Disease ravaged the settlers, their supplies dwindled, and their agricultural efforts proved catastrophically inadequate. By winter, they were dying at rates that horrified even hardened soldiers. Into this desperate situation stepped John Smith, ambitious, self-promoting, and absolutely convinced of his own destiny. Smith's background reveals much about the colonial mindset. He was a professional soldier who had fought in Eastern Europe, a man accustomed to violence and comfortable with the idea that might makes right. His writings reveal a personality that modern readers might recognize as narcissistic. Every story centers on his own heroism. Every encounter becomes an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority over both enemies and allies. Reading Smith's accounts, I'm struck by how they read like adventure novels rather than historical documents. This isn't accidental. Smith was writing for an audience of potential investors and future colonists, people who needed to believe that Virginia offered opportunity rather than death. Smith's later writings, penned in self-promotion and exile, claim a dramatic rescue, yet no contemporary Powhatan account supports a death-defying ceremony. More importantly, no contemporary English account mentions this supposed salvation. The story first appears in Smith's writings more than 15 years after the alleged event, conveniently timed to coincide with Pocahontas' celebrity in London. What likely happened was far more mundane and far more interesting. Smith was captured during one of his trading expeditions and brought before Wahunsenakau. Rather than a death sentence, this was probably a diplomatic opportunity, a chance for the paramount chief to assess these strange newcomers and determine how they might fit into his existing political structure. More plausibly, a highly ritualized adoption, he invited Smith into the chief's orbit, a political theater he misunderstood as salvation. Many Native American societies had well-established protocols for incorporating outsiders, rituals that could transform enemies into allies, strangers into family members. These ceremonies often involved apparent threats, followed by salvation, not because the threat was real, but because the dramatic arc reinforced the significance of the transformation. Imagine an 11-year-old observing foreign men who mistook diplomatic rights for affection. Matoaka would have watched these proceedings with the trained eye of a diplomat's daughter, recognizing the ceremonial elements that Smith interpreted as genuine danger. She would have seen her father's careful performance, the way he managed to extend protection to the English while maintaining his own authority and dignity. Already, myth was sprouting from misinterpretation. Smith saw salvation where Powhatan leaders saw standard diplomatic protocol. The English interpreted elaborate ceremony as primitive theatricality. Neither side fully understood what the other was trying to communicate, yet both sides walked away convinced they had achieved their objectives. It fascinates me how storytelling instinctively centers the outsider hero. Was Smith composing adventure, or did he truly misread Powhatan rituals? History offers only the silence between two cultures, each speaking past the other in languages that carried fundamentally different assumptions about power, relationships, and the nature of truth itself. This encounter represents a microcosm of the broader colonial project. Europeans arrived with assumptions about civilization, savagery, and proper social order that made genuine cultural exchange nearly impossible. They interpreted Powhatan sophistication as primitive cunning, Powhatan diplomacy as treacherous manipulation, Powhatan generosity as weakness to be exploited. The Powhatan people, for their part, initially tried to incorporate these newcomers into their existing social framework. They offered trade relationships, extended hospitality, and attempted to establish the kinds of reciprocal obligations that bound their own society together. They could not have anticipated that the English brought with them a completely different understanding of property, power, and human relationships. The encounter between Smith and the Powhatan leadership reveals the tragedy of first contact. Both sides acted according to their own cultural logic. Both sides believed they were succeeding in their objectives, and both sides were completely wrong about what the other side was thinking. Matoaka, watching from the edges of this cultural collision, was witnessing the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not only her own life, but the entire world she had known. From 1607 to 1613, Matoaka traveled between Jamestown and Werowocomoco with baskets of corn or messages of goodwill. But to understand her role, we must first understand the complex diplomatic dance in which she was participating. Each visit layered new misunderstandings, yet somehow the fragile peace held. The Powhatan Confederation operated on principles of reciprocal obligation. When they provided food to the starving colonists, they expected not just payment, but relationship, ongoing exchanges that would bind the two communities together in networks of mutual dependence. The English, operating from a market economy mindset, saw these transactions as simple commercial exchanges. They paid for corn and considered the relationship complete. Matoaka served as more than a messenger in these negotiations. She was a cultural interpreter, someone who could read the subtle signs of English mood and report back to her father about colonial intentions. Her youth provided her with a kind of diplomatic immunity. She could observe without threatening, question without challenging, and move between communities without triggering the masculine posturing that characterized formal negotiations between adult leaders. When I picture her walking the narrow palisades of Jamestown, I wonder whether she felt curiosity, fear, or simply duty. The historical record preserves her actions but not her emotions, her movements but not her thoughts. We can only imagine the internal landscape of a young woman navigating between two worlds that seemed increasingly incompatible. Even during these early years, European observers were already transforming Matoaka into a symbol rather than a person. Colonial chroniclers described her as well-featured but wanton, of great spirit, and apt to visit our fort. These descriptions reveal more about European expectations than Powhatan reality. They were looking for either noble savages or dangerous primitives, not complex individuals operating within sophisticated cultural frameworks. The colonists saw a singular Indian princess. Powhatan leaders saw a child emissary. Each side interpreted her presence through their own cultural lens, creating parallel narratives that would eventually crystallize into the myths we know today. The English needed her to be proof that Native Americans could be civilized, converted, and incorporated into colonial society. The Powhatan needed her to be evidence that peaceful coexistence was possible despite mounting tensions. She moved like tidewater, neither fully English nor fully distanced from her own people, but ebbing and flowing in response to seasonal need. This liminal position gave her unique insights into both cultures, but it also left her increasingly isolated from both. She was becoming something new, something unprecedented, a cultural bridge in an age when bridges were being burned as quickly as they could be built. European descriptions of Matoaka during this period reveal the colonizing mindset in operation. She was simultaneously exoticized and domesticated, praised for her natural virtue while being criticized for her savage customs. Colonial writers could not see her as simply a young woman doing her job as a diplomat. She had to be either a potential convert to Christianity or a threat to colonial morality. This process of mythologization was not unique to Matoaka. It was standard colonial practice. Indigenous leaders were either noble savages deserving of respect or bloodthirsty primitives deserving of destruction, with no middle ground allowed for the kind of complex, contradictory humanity that defines all human beings. The colonial imagination needed simple stories, clear moral frameworks, and obvious heroes and villains. Complexity rarely survives in folklore, and Matoaka's complexity was being systematically erased even as she lived it. The real woman, curious, intelligent, skilled in cross-cultural communication burdened with impossible responsibilities, was disappearing beneath layers of European interpretation and wishful thinking. By 1610, the delicate balance that had sustained peace was beginning to collapse. The English colonists, reinforced by new arrivals and emboldened by improved supplies, were making increasingly aggressive demands. They wanted not just trade relationships, but territorial concessions. Not just peaceful coexistence, but cultural submission. Matoaka found herself caught between escalating demands from both sides. The English expected her to convince her father to grant them more land, more food, more political accommodation. The Powhatan leadership expected her to convince the English to limit their expansion, respect existing boundaries, and honor their promises of mutual respect. These were impossible tasks. The fundamental assumptions of the two cultures were moving toward irreconcilable conflict. The English believed in individual property ownership, cultural superiority, and their divine right to claim and transform the landscape. The Powhatan believed in collective stewardship, cultural autonomy, and their ancestral obligation to preserve the land for future generations. By 1613, Matoaka had spent 6 years navigating between two worlds that were becoming increasingly hostile to each other. She had served as diplomat, interpreter, and peacekeeper, but the forces of history were moving beyond what any individual could control. The stage was being set for the crisis that would transform her from a diplomatic bridge into a political prisoner, from a cultural interpreter into a symbol of colonial domination. In April 1613, Captain Samuel Argall seized Matoaka, luring her aboard an English vessel under pretense of trade. But to understand the full impact of this betrayal, we must first understand what it meant in both cultures. The act itself was brief, a few moments of deception on the Potomac River, but its consequences would ripple through both societies for generations. Argall had been seeking a way to gain leverage over the Powhatan Confederation. Relations had deteriorated throughout 1612, with increasing incidents of violence and theft on both sides. The English colonial leadership, frustrated by their inability to extract the concessions they wanted through negotiation, decided that kidnapping the paramount chief's daughter would provide them with the bargaining chip they needed. The plan required careful orchestration. Argall enlisted the help of a local Patawomac chief, offering him gifts in exchange for his cooperation in luring Matoaka aboard the English ship. The Patawomac were tributaries of the Powhatan Confederation, but their relationship with Wahunsenakau was complicated by their own territorial interests and their growing fear of English military power. For Matoaka, the invitation to visit the English ship would have seemed routine. She had made similar diplomatic visits dozens of times over the previous 6 years. She may have brought gifts, messages from her father, or simply planned to gather intelligence about English intentions. Instead, she found herself a prisoner watched by armed guards as the ship sailed toward Jamestown. I try to imagine the moment when she realized what was happening. The sudden understanding that the rules of diplomacy had been abandoned, that her status as an ambassador counted for nothing, that she was now simply a commodity to be traded in negotiations between her father and the English colonial government. The Powhatan world reeled. The kidnapping of a paramount chief's daughter was not just a personal assault. It was an attack on the entire political system that held the Confederation together. Wahunsenakau's ability to protect his own family was directly connected to his authority over tributary chiefs. If he could not secure his daughter's release, his political position would be severely compromised. The initial Powhatan response was measured and diplomatic. Wahunsenakau sent delegations to Jamestown offering to exchange English prisoners for his daughter's return. He offered corn, tools, and promises of future cooperation. The English colonial leadership, however, had decided that they held the winning hand. They demanded not just the return of stolen English property, but territorial concessions, political submission, and cultural capitulation. These negotiations revealed the fundamental gap between Powhatan and English concepts of justice and honor. For the Powhatan, holding a diplomat hostage violated the basic principles that made civilization possible. For the English, Matoaka's captivity was simply a practical solution to their political problems. They were not interested in exchange or compromise. They wanted surrender. Held in Henricus and later Jamestown, she learned Anglican prayers beside ticking muskets. The physical conditions of her captivity were probably better than those experienced by many English colonists. She was too valuable to be mistreated in ways that might damage her health or undermine her potential usefulness in negotiations. But the psychological conditions were devastating. She was cut off from her family, her community, and her cultural support systems. Every aspect of her daily life was controlled by her captors, from what she ate to how she dressed to whom she could speak with. She was surrounded by people who spoke a language she understood imperfectly, who followed customs that seemed arbitrary and cruel, and who treated her alternately as a trophy and a tool. The English kept detailed records of their negotiations with Wahunsenakau, but they recorded almost nothing about Matoaka's daily experience during this period. She had become invisible as a person, visible only as a political symbol. During her captivity, she was assigned a tutor, probably a minister or educated colonist, tasked with teaching her English customs and Christian doctrine. This education was actually a form of cultural assault designed to strip away her Powhatan identity and replace it with English alternatives. She was taught to see her own culture as savage and primitive, her own spiritual traditions as demonic and false. After months of negotiation, the English demanded concessions. Captors discovered that spiritual conversion brought prestige in London. The Virginia Company was under intense pressure from investors and critics who questioned the moral legitimacy of the colonial project. Converting a savage princess to Christianity would provide powerful propaganda for the colony's defenders. The conversion process was carefully orchestrated for maximum political impact. Matoaka was instructed in Christian doctrine, taught to recite prayers and biblical passages, and prepared for the public ceremony that would mark her transformation from Powhatan diplomat to Christian convert. The ritual was designed not just to change her spiritual allegiance, but to demonstrate English cultural superiority to both colonial and metropolitan audiences. The gentle word baptism often hides the rough edges of power. Faith offered in chains is not the faith of free hearts. Within a small timber chapel, Matoaka accepted baptism as Rebecca, the name chosen for the biblical matriarch who bridged nations, spoke volumes about English intentions. Rebecca, in biblical tradition, was the wife of Isaac and mother of Jacob, a woman whose decisions shaped the destiny of nations. The English were not just converting Matoaka to Christianity, they were positioning her as the mother of a new hybrid civilization that would combine English culture with American geography. The captivity and conversion of Matoaka represents one of the most psychologically complex episodes in early American history. She was simultaneously victim and survivor, convert and resistance fighter, symbol and human being. Her experience reveals the brutal efficiency of colonial cultural assault, but also the remarkable resilience of individuals caught in the machinery of historical transformation. John Rolfe entered captivity's chamber bearing tobacco, seedlings, and ambition. But to understand his relationship with the woman he would marry, we must first understand the man himself. A widower of 28, Rolfe had already experienced profound loss. His first wife and child had died during the voyage to Virginia, leaving him alone in a hostile new world with nothing but his agricultural experiments and his burning desire to make his fortune. Rolfe was not simply a farmer. He was an entrepreneur, a risk-taker, and a man who understood that success in the New World required not just hard work, but strategic thinking. His experiments with tobacco cultivation represented years of careful observation, trial and error, and systematic improvement of Native American agricultural techniques. He was, in many ways, the perfect colonial figure, intelligent enough to learn from indigenous knowledge, ambitious enough to commercialize it, and culturally blind enough to see nothing wrong with appropriating it. His letters reveal a man struggling with his own desires and his cultural conditioning. He was attracted to Matoaka, but he was also deeply concerned about the social and religious implications of marrying a savage. His correspondence with colonial authorities reads like a man arguing with himself, seeking permission for something he had already decided to do, while simultaneously justifying his decision in terms that his society would find acceptable. In modern terms, we call this a diplomatic marriage. I hesitate to judge their hearts, but I can't ignore the political scaffolding propping up their vows. The historical record preserves Rolfe's perspective on their courtship, but almost nothing of Matoaka's. His letters to the colonial governor describe his internal struggle between desire and duty, his fear that marrying her would damage his reputation, and his ultimate conviction that the marriage would serve the good of this plantation, the honor of our country, for the glory of God. These phrases reveal the complex motivations behind the marriage. Rolfe genuinely seems to have been attracted to Matoaka, but he also recognized that marrying her would provide him with political and economic advantages. As the daughter of the paramount chief, she could facilitate trade relationships, provide access to Native American agricultural knowledge, and serve as a bridge between the English and Powhatan communities. For Matoaka, the marriage may have represented her best available option for survival and for maintaining some connection to her previous life. As a Christian convert and colonial prisoner, she could not return to her father's household unchanged. Marriage to a prominent English colonist would provide her with status, protection, and a defined role in colonial society. It would also allow her to continue serving as a cultural bridge, though now from within the English community rather than between communities. The 1614 marriage brought 8 years of fragile peace, as cargoes of sweet tobacco sailed east. The wedding ceremony itself was a carefully choreographed political event designed to demonstrate English success in civilizing the indigenous population while simultaneously showcasing colonial prosperity and potential to investors back in England. The guest list included colonial officials, prominent planters, and Powhatan representatives, a mix that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The ceremony followed English customs, with Matoaka dressed in European fashion and speaking English vows that she may have understood imperfectly. The symbolism was clear. this was not just a marriage between two individuals, but a merger between two cultures, with English culture clearly in the dominant position. The marriage created what historians call the Peace of Pocahontas, a period of relative calm that allowed both communities to recover from the violence and uncertainty of the previous years. Trade flourished, territorial boundaries were respected, and violent incidents decreased dramatically. From a diplomatic perspective, the marriage was a remarkable success. But the peace came at a cost. It was based on Matoaka's personal sacrifice and her willingness to serve as a bridge between communities that remained fundamentally hostile to each other. She had become a human treaty, her individual happiness secondary to the larger political needs of both societies. Rolfe's private letters reveal affection tinged with missionary zeal, yet her words remain unrecorded, a reminder that power often dictates who holds the quill. As Rebecca Rolfe, Matoaka learned to navigate English colonial society, managing a household, participating in church services, and raising the son who would become the living symbol of Anglo-Powhatan cooperation. The tobacco plantation that became the foundation of the Rolfe family fortune was built on a combination of English capital, Native American agricultural knowledge, and African slave labor. Matoaka found herself at the center of the economic system that would define Virginia for the next 2 centuries, a system that depended on the exploitation of both indigenous knowledge and enslaved African labor. Her daily life as a planter's wife would have been filled with domestic responsibilities that were utterly foreign to her upbringing. She learned to manage English-style households, supervise the labor of servants and slaves, and participate in the social rituals that defined colonial society. She attended Anglican church services, participated in English social gatherings, and raised her son according to English customs. What we don't know about Matoaka's life during this period is perhaps more significant than what we do know. Did she maintain any connection to Powhatan spiritual practices? Did she speak Algonquian with her son? Did she dream in her native language? Did she ever regret her conversion and marriage? The historical silence around these questions reflects the broader colonial project of cultural erasure. Successful assimilation required the complete abandonment of indigenous identity, the transformation of Native Americans into English colonists who happened to have Native American ancestry. Matoaka's success as Rebecca Rolfe depended on her ability to become invisible as a Powhatan woman and visible only as a colonial success story. In 1616, Rebecca Rolfe boarded the George alongside her infant son Thomas and a small entourage of Powhatan kinsfolk. But the decision to travel to England was not simply a family vacation. It was a carefully planned promotional campaign designed to showcase colonial success to potential investors and to demonstrate the Virginia Company's ability to civilize the indigenous population. The Virginia Company was in financial trouble. The colony had consumed vast amounts of capital while producing minimal returns, and critics in London were questioning whether the entire venture was worth the investment. The company's directors recognized that bringing a converted Indian princess to London would generate enormous publicity and potentially attract new investment to the struggling colony. For Matoaka, the journey represented an opportunity to see the world that had produced the colonists who had so dramatically altered her life. She would have been curious about English society, eager to understand the cultural context that had shaped the men and women who had arrived in her homeland with such confidence and such devastating effect. The preparation for the journey required months of planning. Matoaka had to be outfitted with appropriate clothing for English society, trained in the complex social protocols of London life, and prepared for the kind of public attention that would greet her arrival. She was traveling not as a private individual, but as a public symbol, and every aspect of her appearance and behavior would be scrutinized for evidence of successful colonial policy. Crossing the Atlantic, she exchanged the hush of cypress groves for London's damp cobblestones. But the transition was far more dramatic than simply geographical. London in 1616 was a city of nearly 200,000 people, the largest city she had ever imagined. The noise, the crowds, the smoke, the smells, everything would have assaulted her senses in ways that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. London society received her as a curiosity and a trophy. She was invited to court, introduced to nobility, and displayed at public events as evidence of English colonial success. The royal court was fascinated by this Indian princess who spoke English, wore European fashion, and professed Christian faith. She was living proof that the colonial project could succeed, that savages could be transformed into civilized Christians. I once stared at this portrait for 15 minutes in a quiet reading room. The longer I looked, the more the lace seemed like delicate chains, beautiful, confining, and undeniably foreign. Portraitists draped her in stiff ruffs and tall hats, visually rewriting her identity for curious patrons. One engraving freezes her at 21. Calm gaze, European fashion, Algonquian spirit somewhere behind, watchful eyes. These portraits were not simply artistic representations, they were political documents, designed to show metropolitan audiences that the colonial project was both morally justified and practically successful. Every public appearance required Matoaka to perform her conversion, to demonstrate her successful transformation from savage to civilized Christian. She attended church services, participated in court ceremonies, and engaged in the complex social rituals that defined English aristocratic society. She was simultaneously the star of the show and imprisoned by her role. The pressure of constant performance must have been exhausting. She could not simply be herself. She had to be the perfect convert, the ideal colonial subject, the living embodiment of English cultural superiority. Every gesture was scrutinized, every word analyzed for evidence of successful assimilation or lingering savagery. Behind the public performance, she was also experiencing London as a human being. She was seeing the poverty and wealth, the complexity and contradiction, the grandeur and squalor of the society that had produced the colonists who had transformed her world. She was learning about English social hierarchies, economic systems, and cultural assumptions that had seemed natural and inevitable to the colonists, but must have appeared arbitrary and strange to someone raised in Powhatan society. One of the most emotionally complex moments of her London visit was her reunion with John Smith. Smith had returned to England years earlier and had become something of a celebrity himself, writing books and giving lectures about his adventures in Virginia. The meeting between Smith and Matoaka was carefully orchestrated by the Virginia Company, designed to generate publicity and reinforce the narrative of colonial success. The historical record preserves only Smith's account of their meeting, and his description reveals more about his own ego than about Matoaka's experience. He claims that she was so overcome with emotion at seeing him again that she could barely speak. More likely, she was struggling with the complex feelings aroused by encountering the man whose self-promotional storytelling had transformed her into a mythical figure. Matoaka's time in London represents the height of her transformation from Powhatan diplomat to colonial symbol. She had become a living advertisement for the colonial project, proof that English culture could triumph over indigenous savagery. But she was also a human being struggling with homesickness, cultural dislocation, and the impossible burden of representing an entire people to a society that saw her as both exotic curiosity and political trophy. March 1617. The George prepared to sail home, but the decision to leave England was not simply a matter of completing a successful promotional tour. Matoaka had spent months in London society, experiencing the wealth and power of the empire that had colonized her homeland, and she was ready to return to Virginia with new knowledge and new questions about the relationship between her adopted English identity and her Powhatan heritage. The Virginia Company was pleased with the publicity generated by her visit. She had been received at court, portrayed by fashionable artists, and celebrated in pamphlets and broadsides as proof of colonial success. Her very presence in London had helped counter criticism of the colonial project and had potentially attracted new investment to the struggling Virginia enterprise. For Matoaka, the prospect of returning to Virginia may have represented an opportunity to reconnect with her family and her cultural roots, while maintaining her new identity as Rebecca Rolfe. She had spent nearly 4 years as a Christian convert and English colonial wife, but she had never lost her connection to her Powhatan identity. The journey home would allow her to navigate the complex task of integrating these different aspects of her identity. Somewhere between London soot and briny estuary air, Rebecca fell violently ill, perhaps of pneumonia, perhaps dysentery, perhaps the combination of diseases that made sea voyages so dangerous in the early 17th century. The exact cause of her illness remains unknown, but the symptoms described by contemporary observers suggest a respiratory infection complicated by digestive distress. The timing of her illness was particularly tragic. She had survived the cultural trauma of captivity, conversion, and marriage. She had successfully navigated the complex social world of London society. She had demonstrated remarkable resilience in adapting to radically different cultural environments. But she could not survive the disease environment that made transatlantic travel so dangerous for everyone regardless of their cultural background or social status. The ship's captain faced a difficult decision. He could continue the voyage and hope that she would recover during the Atlantic crossing, or he could put into port and seek medical treatment for his distinguished passenger. The decision to stop at Gravesend may have been motivated by genuine concern for her welfare, or it may have been calculated to avoid the scandal that would result if she died during the voyage. Within days, she died, aged roughly 21, but the circumstances of her death reveal the complex web of relationships and obligations that had come to define her life. Standing on the deck at Gravesend, Rolfe wrote that she passed with words of comfort, yet Powhatan voices record only loss. The town of Gravesend, located on the Thames estuary, was a common stopping point for ships preparing for Atlantic voyages. It was a place of transition where travelers could make final preparations, take on supplies, and say goodbye to England. For Matoaka, it became the place where her own transition between worlds came to an end. I've walked that churchyard. Beneath ordinary stones rests an extraordinary bridge between worlds, now weathered smooth by English rain. Her final words, as recorded by English observers, were reported to be expressions of Christian faith and acceptance of God's will. But we must remember that these accounts were written by people who needed her death to conform to Christian expectations of holy dying. Her actual final thoughts about her son, her family, her homeland, her complex journey between cultures remain unknown. She was interred in St. George's Church as Rebecca, daughter of the mighty Prince Powhatan. The inscription on her grave marker reveals the persistent colonial confusion about her identity. She was buried under her Christian name, but her parentage was described in terms that reflected European assumptions about Native American political structures. Even in death, she remained trapped between two cultural systems that could not fully accommodate her complexity. The River Thames swallowed the echoes of Algonquian songs that might have accompanied her body had she died among her own people. The funeral ceremony followed English Christian traditions, with prayers and hymns that would have been foreign to the cultural world of her childhood. Her body was committed to English soil, far from the Virginia landscape that had shaped her early identity. John Rolfe was left to continue the voyage alone with their young son Thomas. The child would grow up in England, educated as an English gentleman, with only fragmentary knowledge of his mother's cultural heritage. The decision to leave Thomas in England while Rolfe returned to Virginia represented a practical solution to the problem of raising a mixed-race child in one 840 colonial society. But it also meant that the living symbol of Anglo-Powhatan cooperation would grow up completely separated from his Native American heritage. The news of Matoaka's death would not reach Virginia for months, and when it did arrive, it would mark the beginning of the end of the fragile peace that her marriage had created. Without her personal presence to serve as a bridge between the two communities, the underlying tensions that had been temporarily suppressed would resurface with devastating consequences for both societies. Back in Virginia, peace unraveled after Rebecca's death, culminating in warfare by 1622, but the collapse was neither immediate nor inevitable. The marriage-based alliance had created a delicate balance of interests that required constant maintenance, careful negotiation, and the ongoing presence of individuals committed to making the relationship work. With Matoaka's death, the personal bond that had held the alliance together began to weaken. Wahunsenakau, the paramount chief, had never fully recovered from the kidnapping of his daughter. The marriage had provided him with a face-saving resolution to an impossible situation, but it had also demonstrated the limits of his power to protect his own family. His death in 1618, just 1 year after his daughter's, marked the end of an era in Powhatan political leadership. His successor, his brother Opechancanough, brought a different perspective to Anglo-Powhatan relations. Where Wahunsenakau had sought accommodation and coexistence, Opechancanough increasingly saw the English presence as an existential threat to Powhatan survival. The steady expansion of English settlements, the increasing demands for land, and the growing English population convinced him that peaceful coexistence was impossible. The English, for their part, interpreted the peace that had followed Matoaka's marriage as evidence of their cultural and military superiority. They had convinced themselves that the Native Americans had accepted English dominance and were prepared to gradually assimilate into colonial society. They were completely unprepared for the coordinated uprising that would devastate the colony in 1622. The attack of March 22, 1622, killed nearly 350 English colonists and destroyed numerous settlements throughout the Virginia colony. From the English perspective, it was a treacherous assault on peaceful settlers who had been living in harmony with their Native American neighbors. From the Powhatan perspective, it was a desperate attempt to drive out invaders who were systematically destroying their homeland. The uprising marked the end of any pretense of equality between the two societies. The English response was swift and brutal, involving systematic campaigns of destruction that targeted Native American food supplies, settlements, and population centers. The war that followed would continue intermittently for decades, creating a cycle of violence and retaliation that would define Anglo-Native relations throughout the colonial period. It's here that the danger of single-story history becomes stark. One woman's complex life turned into propaganda for settlement, erasing the chorus of other native voices. The colonial response to the uprising also marked the beginning of a new narrative about Anglo-Native relations. Where earlier colonial writers had emphasized the possibility of peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit, post-1622 colonial literature increasingly portrayed Native Americans as inherently treacherous and violent, incapable of civilization, and deserving of whatever violence was necessary to secure English safety and prosperity. Her son Thomas remained in England until adulthood. On his return, he became a cultural liminal figure, too English for some settlers, too distant for Powhatan kin who had survived epidemics and violence. His experience represents the broader challenge faced by mixed-race individuals in colonial society, caught between communities that increasingly define themselves in opposition to each other. Thomas received an English education and was raised as a gentleman, but his mixed ancestry made his social position ambiguous. When he returned to Virginia as a young man, he inherited his father's tobacco plantation and his mother's complicated legacy. He was simultaneously a symbol of successful colonial assimilation and a reminder of the violent process through which that assimilation had been achieved. His relationship with his surviving Powhatan relatives was complex and strained. He had grown up speaking only English, practicing only Christianity, and following only European customs. He was a stranger to the cultural world that had shaped his mother's early life, yet his physical appearance and family history connected him to a community that had been devastated by colonial violence. Colonists invoked her marriage as proof of civilizing success, while Powhatan oral tradition grieved a daughter lost to foreign shores. These competing narratives reveal the different ways that communities process traumatic historical events. For the English colonists, Matoaka's story became evidence that their colonial project was both morally justified and practically successful. She had chosen civilization over savagery, Christianity over paganism, English culture over indigenous tradition. For the Powhatan people, her story was one of loss and displacement. She had been taken from her community, forced to abandon her cultural identity, and had died far from home without the opportunity to pass on her knowledge and experience to the next generation. Her marriage had brought temporary peace, but it had also demonstrated the price that individuals paid for colonial accommodation. These competing narratives would shape historical memory for centuries, with different communities emphasizing different aspects of her story depending on their political and cultural needs. She became simultaneously a symbol of colonial success and indigenous resistance, of cultural transformation and cultural loss, of individual agency and structural oppression. Fast forward to 1995. A vibrant animated film adds swirling willows and pastel mornings, aging Pocahontas into full romance, compressing timelines, and granting her an impossible choice between love and war. But To understand why Disney's version resonates so powerfully with audiences while distorting historical reality so dramatically, we must first understand the cultural needs that the Pocahontas myth has served in American society. The Disney film was not the first popular retelling of the Pocahontas story. For centuries, American writers, artists, and performers had been reshaping her story to serve contemporary political and cultural purposes. During the American Revolution, she became a symbol of America's connection to the land and its independence from European authority. During the Civil War, she represented the possibility of racial reconciliation and national unity. During the women's suffrage movement, she embodied female strength and independence. Each generation has reinvented Pocahontas to serve its own needs, and Disney's version reflects the cultural concerns of the 1990s: environmentalism, multiculturalism, and the empowerment of young women. The studio's artistry is undeniable. The story's omissions are profound. Where the film sings adventure, history whispers captivity. Where it paints mutual love, archives describe delicate diplomacy turned coercion. The Disney version transforms a complex historical figure into a simple romantic heroine. But this transformation serves specific cultural functions. It allows American audiences to feel good about their history while avoiding the uncomfortable realities of colonialism, cultural destruction, and ongoing inequality. It presents a vision of intercultural harmony that never actually existed while ignoring the systematic violence that characterized actual colonial relations. I still hum the soundtrack sometimes, but now each melody carries echoing footfalls of a child weaving through river reeds, unseen by her modern audience. The most obvious distortion involves age and romance. Disney's Pocahontas is a young woman capable of romantic love, while a historical Matoaka was a child during her encounters with John Smith. The film creates a love story where history records diplomatic contact between a prepubescent girl and an adult man. This transformation is not simply inaccurate. It fundamentally misrepresents the power dynamics and cultural context of their relationship. The film also presents Pocahontas as making a free choice between her indigenous culture and English civilization. But the historical record shows that she was kidnapped, held captive, and forced to convert to Christianity. Disney's version empowers its heroine with agency and choice, while the historical Matoaka was stripped of both. The film's empowering narrative requires erasing the reality of colonial violence and coercion. Environmental themes dominate the Disney version, with Pocahontas serving as a spokesperson for harmony between humans and nature. This portrayal reflects contemporary concerns about environmental destruction, but it also perpetuates stereotypes about Native Americans as inherently more environmental than Europeans. The historical record shows that both cultures had complex relationships with the natural world, shaped by practical needs as much as spiritual beliefs. The film's treatment of cultural difference is perhaps its most problematic aspect. Disney presents two cultures as fundamentally compatible, separated only by misunderstanding and prejudice. The historical reality was far more complex, involving competing claims to land, incompatible economic systems, and fundamentally different understandings of property, authority, and social organization. The film's optimistic multiculturalism obscures the structural conflicts that made peaceful coexistence impossible. Recognizing the difference isn't about condemning childhood favorites. It's about honoring the real woman beneath the watercolor sky. The Disney film serves important cultural functions, inspiring young viewers to value environmental protection, cultural diversity, and female empowerment. These are worthy goals, and the film's popularity demonstrates its success in communicating these values to mass audiences. But simplified narratives also carry dangers. They can substitute comfortable myths for uncomfortable truths, allowing audiences to avoid confronting the ongoing legacies of historical injustice. They can perpetuate stereotypes and misconceptions that shape contemporary policy and social attitudes. They can erase the complexity and agency of historical figures, reducing them to symbols rather than recognizing them as human beings. The challenge for educators, historians, and storytellers is to find ways to honor both the power of myth and the demands of historical accuracy. We need stories that inspire and educate, that acknowledge complexity while remaining accessible, that serve contemporary needs while respecting historical truth. Native American communities have responded to the Disney film with a mixture of appreciation and criticism. Some appreciate the film's environmental message and its attempt to present a Native American protagonist in a positive light. Others criticize its historical inaccuracies, its perpetuation of stereotypes, and its appropriation of sacred cultural elements for commercial entertainment. The film has sparked important conversations within Native American communities about representation, authenticity, and the challenges of maintaining cultural integrity in a mass media environment. It has also provided opportunities for Native American educators and activists to share more accurate historical information and to challenge popular misconceptions about indigenous peoples. These conversations highlight the ongoing importance of historical accuracy in shaping contemporary understanding and policy. The stories we tell about the past inevitably influence how we think about the present and future, making it essential that those stories acknowledge complexity, respect human dignity, and serve the cause of justice rather than simply entertainment. Matoaka's descendants live on both biologically and culturally, but tracing her legacy requires understanding the difference between genetic inheritance and cultural transmission. Through her son, Thomas Rolfe, she has thousands of descendants scattered throughout the United States, many of whom have claimed connection to her story as a source of pride and identity. But the cultural world that shaped her early life has followed a different path of survival and adaptation. The Powhatan people did not disappear after the colonial period, despite centuries of violence, dispossession, and cultural suppression. Today, several tribes claim descent from the original Powhatan Confederacy, including the Pamunkey, Mattapony, and Patawomeck peoples. These communities have maintained their cultural identity through centuries of adversity, adapting to changing circumstances while preserving essential elements of their ancestral traditions. The relationship between these contemporary communities and the historical figure of Pocahontas is complex and sometimes contentious. For some, she represents a cautionary tale about the dangers of cultural assimilation and the price of accommodation with colonial power. For others, she represents resilience and adaptation, the ability to survive and maintain identity even under the most challenging circumstances. Contemporary Powhatan Lenape educators dismantle myths in classrooms, while indigenous artists reclaim her image through beadwork, poetry, and film. Their work insists that Native women are more than romantic foils. They are subjects of their own stories. These efforts represent a broader movement within Native American communities to reclaim control over their own narratives and to challenge the stereotypes and misconceptions that have shaped popular understanding of indigenous peoples. The Pocahontas story has been appropriated by non-Native Americans for centuries, used to serve purposes that have little to do with historical accuracy or respect for indigenous peoples. From John Smith's self-promotional writings to Disney's animated film, the story has been repeatedly reshaped to serve the needs of non-Native audiences, often at the expense of historical truth and cultural sensitivity. This appropriation takes many forms. Tourist attractions present simplified versions of her story that emphasize romance and adventure while ignoring violence and cultural destruction. Commercial products use her image to sell everything from tobacco to casino entertainment, often without any involvement from or benefit to Native American communities. Popular culture continues to perpetuate stereotypes about Native American women as exotic others, noble savages, or tragic figures. The ongoing appropriation of indigenous stories and symbols reflects broader patterns of cultural colonialism that continue to affect Native American communities today. When non-Native Americans control the narrative about indigenous peoples, they can obscure contemporary realities, perpetuate harmful stereotypes, and avoid accountability for ongoing injustices. In listening to those voices, we enlarge the space history offers for indigenous agency. Contemporary Native American scholars, artists, and activists have been working to reclaim the Pocahontas story and to place it within broader contexts of colonial history and ongoing indigenous resistance. Their work challenges popular myths while offering more complex and accurate understandings of both historical and contemporary Native American experiences. Native American historians like Camilla Townsend have conducted extensive research into the historical records, using both European and indigenous sources to reconstruct more accurate accounts of colonial encounters. Their work reveals the complexity of figures like Matoaka, while challenging the simplified narratives that have dominated popular culture. Indigenous artists have created works that explore the psychological and cultural dimensions of the Pocahontas story, often focusing on themes of loss, survival, and cultural resilience. These works provide alternative perspectives on familiar stories, challenging audiences to think more deeply about the human costs of colonialism and the ongoing strength of indigenous communities. I often ask myself, how many other Pocahontases remain entangled in half-remembered legends, awaiting listeners patient enough to hear the full song? The Pocahontas story continues to resonate because it touches on themes that remain relevant in contemporary American society. The encounter between different cultures, the challenges of maintaining identity in changing circumstances, the relationship between individual choice and structural constraint, and the ongoing legacies of colonial violence and dispossession. Understanding her story accurately requires confronting uncomfortable truths about American history and its ongoing effects on indigenous peoples. It requires acknowledging that the United States was built on the systematic dispossession of Native American lands and the suppression of indigenous cultures. It requires recognizing that many of the problems facing Native American communities today have their roots in colonial policies and attitudes that began in places like Jamestown. The challenge for contemporary Americans is to find ways to honor both the complexity of historical truth and the ongoing presence and perspectives of indigenous peoples. This requires moving beyond simplified narratives of progress and reconciliation to acknowledge the continuing effects of colonialism while supporting indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Educational initiatives that include indigenous perspectives, support for Native American cultural preservation and revitalization, and recognition of indigenous rights and sovereignty all represent steps toward a more just and accurate understanding of American history and its ongoing legacies. For a moment, let's view her life at a glance, a slender arc stretching from 1596 to 1617, marked by childhood liberty, cross-cultural meetings, captivity, marriage, voyage, and death. Notice how swiftly momentous events unfold, yet how enduring their impact proves 4 centuries later. But to understand the full significance of her brief life, we must place it within the broader context of global historical forces that were transforming the world during the early 17th century. Matoaka was born during what historians call the Age of Exploration, when European powers were establishing colonies throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The English colonization of Virginia was part of a broader pattern of European expansion that was reshaping political, economic, and cultural relationships across the globe. The encounter between English colonists and Powhatan peoples was one of thousands of similar encounters taking place as European powers sought to establish control over new territories and populations. The economic forces driving colonization were equally global in scope. The Virginia colony was established to produce commodities for European markets, particularly tobacco, which became one of the most valuable crops in the global economy. The success of tobacco cultivation in Virginia depended on the appropriation of Native American land, the exploitation of Native American agricultural knowledge, and the importation of enslaved African labor. Matoaka's life was shaped by these global economic forces even as she experienced them through local and personal relationships. The cultural and religious dimensions of colonization were also part of broader European patterns. The conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity was a central goal of European colonization throughout the Americas, reflecting both genuine religious conviction and practical political considerations. Christian conversion was seen as a necessary step in the process of civilizing indigenous peoples and incorporating them into European colonial society. 1596. Birth in Senacomica. Childhood in the household of Wahun Senakau. Growing up in a world that had no knowledge of European existence. 1607. First contact with English colonists. Beginning of diplomatic relationship between Powhatan Confederacy and Jamestown Colony. Matoaka begins serving as cultural interpreter and messenger. 1608 to 1612. Period of regular diplomatic contact, with Matoaka traveling frequently between Powhatan and English communities. Development of her skills as cultural interpreter and diplomat. 1613. Kidnapping by Captain Samuel Argall. Beginning of captivity in English colonial settlements. Forced conversion to Christianity and adoption of English customs and language. 1614. Marriage to John Rolfe. Beginning of the Peace of Pocahontas. Establishment of tobacco cultivation as the economic foundation of the Virginia colony. 1615. Birth of son Thomas, the living symbol of Anglo-Powhatan cooperation. Continued life as colonial wife and Christian convert. 1616. Journey to England. Presentation to London society as proof of colonial success. Participation in Virginia Company promotional campaign. 1617. Death at Gravesend while preparing to return to Virginia. Burial in English soil, far from her homeland. What strikes me most about this chronology is the speed with which Matoaka's world changed. In just 21 years, she experienced the complete transformation of her society, the destruction of her cultural world, and her own personal transformation from Powhatan diplomat to English colonial wife. The pace of change was so rapid that individuals had little time to adapt or resist. This pattern of rapid cultural transformation was repeated throughout the Americas as European colonization accelerated during the 17th century. Indigenous peoples who had developed sophisticated societies over thousands of years found themselves confronting unprecedented challenges within the span of a single generation. The speed of change made traditional strategies of adaptation and resistance inadequate for the scale of the transformation that was taking place. Viewing Matoaka's life as a timeline helps us understand both the individual tragedy of her story and the broader historical forces that shaped it. She was not simply a victim of circumstances, but an active participant in historical events that were larger than any individual could control. Her life represents the human dimension of historical processes that are often described in abstract terms like colonization, cultural contact, and imperial expansion. Understanding her story requires recognizing both her individual agency and the structural constraints that limited her choices. She made decisions and took actions that shaped her own destiny, but she did so within a context of colonial violence and cultural destruction that had been set in motion by forces far beyond her control. Stories are rivers. They carry truth, debris, and reflection downstream. Disney's Pocahontas is one current, bright and fast. The archival Pocahontas is another, shaded and meandering. Reverence for the latter does not require damning the former, only acknowledging that both flow from a common spring of human need to remember, to explain, to belong. Rivers change course over time, carrying sediment from one place to another, creating new channels while abandoning old ones. Stories follow similar patterns, adapting to new landscapes while carrying traces of their origins. The Pocahontas story has flowed through American culture for 4 centuries, picking up new meanings and abandoning old ones, shaping the cultural landscape while being shaped by it. The metaphor of stories, as Rivers reminds us, that narrative is not static. Each generation encounters familiar stories within new contexts, bringing different needs and perspectives that inevitably reshape the telling. The challenge for storytellers and audiences is to remain conscious of these changes, to understand how contemporary needs influence historical interpretation, and to resist the temptation to mistake our current version of a story for the definitive truth. The multiplicity of Pocahontas stories, historical, mythical, romantic, political, reflects the complexity of human experience and the inadequacy of any single narrative to capture the full truth of past events. Rather than seeking the true story of Pocahontas, we might better understand her legacy by examining how different versions of her story have served different purposes at different times. Historical narratives serve multiple functions in human society. They help communities understand their origins, justify their current circumstances, and imagine their future possibilities. They provide models of heroism and cautionary tales of failure. They create shared identities and mark boundaries between insiders and outsiders. They offer comfort in times of uncertainty and inspiration in times of challenge. The Pocahontas story has served all of these functions at different times. It has been used to justify American colonization, to promote national unity, to inspire environmental protection, and to challenge racial prejudice. It has provided a model of female courage and a cautionary tale about cultural assimilation. It has been both a source of pride and a cause of shame, depending on the perspective of the storyteller and the needs of the audience. Understanding these functions helps us appreciate why the story continues to resonate while also recognizing the dangers of uncritical acceptance of any single version. When historical narratives serve contemporary political purposes, they can distort our understanding of the past and limit our ability to learn from historical experience. When they oversimplify complex situations, they can perpetuate stereotypes and misconceptions that harm contemporary communities. As we close, I invite you to sit with the gentle rustle of river reeds in your mind and ask, whose voices are still missing from the stories you love? Both storytellers and audiences bear responsibility for the ethical use of historical narratives. Storytellers have an obligation to acknowledge complexity, respect the dignity of historical figures, and consider the contemporary impact of their work. They should strive for accuracy while recognizing that perfect objectivity is impossible, and they should remain open to criticism and correction from affected communities. Audiences have an obligation to approach historical narratives with critical thinking, seeking multiple perspectives and questioning simplified explanations. They should educate themselves about the historical context of familiar stories and remain open to having their assumptions challenged. They should recognize that their own contemporary perspectives inevitably shape their understanding of past events. The relationship between storytellers and audiences is collaborative and ongoing. Stories evolve through repeated telling, with each performance or reading potentially introducing new elements or emphasizing different aspects. This collaborative process can lead to richer and more nuanced understanding, but it can also result in distortion and misrepresentation if not guided by ethical considerations and respect for historical truth. Matoaka's story continues to evolve as new generations encounter it within new contexts. Contemporary Native American artists and scholars are reclaiming the narrative, offering perspectives that center indigenous experience and challenge colonial assumptions. Their work represents not just historical correction, but cultural revitalization, using the past to strengthen contemporary identity and resistance. The digital age has created new opportunities for multiple voices to participate in historical storytelling. Social media, online archives, and digital humanities projects have made it possible for previously marginalized perspectives to reach broad audiences. These new technologies also create new challenges, as the speed and volume of digital communication can make it difficult to distinguish between careful scholarship and casual opinion. The future of the Pocahontas story will depend on our collective willingness to embrace complexity, acknowledge past injustices, and create space for multiple perspectives. It will require ongoing dialogue between different communities, respect for indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and commitment to truth-telling, even when the truth is uncomfortable. As we close this extended meditation on the life and legacy of the woman we have known as Pocahontas, but who was born as Matoaka, we are left with questions rather than answers. How do we honor the complexity of historical figures while still finding meaning and inspiration in their stories? How do we acknowledge the violence and injustice of the past while still appreciating the courage and resilience of individuals who survived it? How do we tell stories that serve contemporary needs while respecting historical truth? These questions have no easy answers, but they are essential to ask. The alternative is to remain trapped in simplified narratives that obscure rather than illuminate, that comfort rather than challenge, that perpetuate rather than transform. Matoaka's story, in all its complexity and contradiction, offers us an opportunity to practice the kind of historical thinking that democracy requires: nuanced, empathetic, and committed to truth even when truth is difficult. The gentle rustle of river reeds continues, carrying with it the whisper of all the voices that have been silenced, all the stories that remain untold, all the questions that await our patient listening